Unfortunately, we were not allowed in the courtroom. The courtroom was locked. We had expected to request to move for a stay of these proceedings. There are some serious issues that are going on with this particular indictment, aside from the fact of how embarrassing this is for the city of New Orleans. It is also a complete misuse of the criminal justice system for various reasons. We attempted to go back into the courtroom after the bond was issued, and we were told by Judge Roche we were not allowed in, that we could see ourselves out of the courtroom. So we are expecting to file emergency proceedings in this matter. There are several concerning matters that hopefully you all will begin to look into involving conflicts of interest. Not only that, but involving tampering with the grand jury. We have a conflict of interest of Judge Roche himself here, who oversees 38 cases that the Attorney General is prosecuting in his section of court. At the same time, he has hand-selected a special prosecutor to indict the Attorney General. So we have a conflict of issue of the judge, a conflict of interest with the judge here. He is also been reported, and it has been reported to the Attorney General, that he has engaged in conducting fake trials as a judge in criminal district court. All of those create a pretty serious conflict of interest for the judge. In addition to that, he hand-selected former Judge Lori White to be the special prosecutor in this matter, who is currently represented by the Attorney General in a civil matter in which she is accused of sexual harassment. That matter was in court as recent as last week. It is incumbent upon Judge Roche to determine if there are any conflicts of interest before appointing a special prosecutor. We certainly expect that that would have happened in this case, and we see that it did not. So we have serious concerns here, aside from the fact that we have reporting in the newspaper and given by Special Prosecutor Lori White herself communications directly from grand jurors. It is against the law to violate the secrecy of a grand jury. We know that grand jurors are communicating with people and influencing investigations, whether it be them directly or through the influence of other people outside of that grand jury. We have that being reported directly from the media, that grand jury is speaking to members outside of that grand jury. That's a very, very serious problem, and it will affect the integrity of every indictment that came out of that particular grand jury. That's very concerning to the public. All of these matters we had expected and hoped to raise in front of Judge Roche. It is no surprise that he locked the door and kept us out in an effort to keep that from being placed on the record. We expect to file emergency motions in this matter to have those issues heard by a higher court.
What about the fact that the grand jury indictment was handed up in a sealed courtroom, and when we objected, our investigative producer was handcuffed?
I think it's very telling. I wasn't there for that incident. It doesn't surprise me, though. We were treated similarly when we attempted to go into Judge Roche's courtroom. It certainly shows that they're attempting to isolate and hide what's going on here. I would be, too, if I were them, given what has recently come out in terms of just alone the conflicts of interest. Very alarming conflicts coming not only from the judge, but from the special prosecutor herself, and the fact that we have grand jurors leaking information to the public. So that's going to have really lasting effects on a lot of prosecutions, and a lot of people should be asking about the integrity of what's happening in the grand jury. How often is this happening? How many other indictments could be affected by this? Is this a standard practice? All of those very concerning things, and the fact that they are making such a deliberate effort to keep the media out of that courtroom speaks volumes.
When does this stop escalating? It keeps escalating. There are threats of prosecution, then now there is prosecution. When does this stop?
I think this is, a very desperate attempt for attention. We see that in New Orleans, really a misuse of the criminal justice system. It should be alarming to everybody that this is how the criminal justice system could be manipulated in a circumstance like this. This is obviously an attention grab here, politically motivated, and so it's unfortunate that something like this could ultimately lead to affecting further investigations. Maybe it was necessary to happen, though, because I think the public should definitely know what's going on in criminal court. I think it's important for us to see this firsthand, and I think there will be a very aggressive effort to get to the bottom of this.
Do you have any concerns that other media outlets were getting sources before the indictment even came through?
Sure. The Attorney General herself said she had no idea this was even going on. In fact, the media reported it first. The media reported that information was coming straight from a grand juror about this. all of that very, very concerning. We certainly expect the grand jury process to be conducted with dignity. We expect it to be conducted in respect for the secrecy of the grand jury. That's the whole the precept behind a grand jury, and I expect a further investigation into those leaks.
What about Judge White's concern that this is New Orleans responding to threats from the Attorney General and standing up for itself?
I think the letter that the Attorney General sent speaks for itself. She is citing the law. She is legally required to uphold the law. And the Supreme Court said she was correct. That was correct. What she says about the law was correct. That was accurate. So I don't think anybody perceived this to be a threat that is what is anticipated by this particular law, which specifically talks about acts of violence or threats of violence. Again, this is a lot of theater, and I really think that this will end up exposing a lot of things that perhaps needed to be exposed.
Do you agree with the governor when he calls this building a kangaroo court, and ultimately do you think that the Attorney General will ever turn herself in?
Well, I think the Attorney General is going to do whatever the law requires her to do. She's going to file emergency motions at this time to try to stay the proceedings, just because there are so many conflicts of interest here. I mean, we have a special prosecutor here who is also being represented by the Attorney General, has a financial interest in that representation. They were in court just last week. She has reached out to the Attorney General's office with concern about that representation now recently, which shows she has some concerns about whether or not she, in fact, herself admits there's a conflict here. So that is very, very problematic. And I agree with the governor. I don't think anybody's going to look at this and not believe that we have a kangaroo court. I think, you know, it's really a shame as we see crime go down that we have to now question the integrity of what's happening in the process of our grand jury investigations. That's very, very concerning. This was the end of this grand jury's time period. We don't know how many cases they oversaw. We don't know how many communications grand jurors were having with the public on other very serious crimes. Remember, cases that are required to go before a grand jury are cases where a mandatory life sentence is required. Those are our most serious crimes in New Orleans. We really don't want grand jurors being tampered with, whether by politicians or by the public, and without a doubt, that has happened here. So that will have an effect on all of the criminal prosecutions. It's certainly fair to say that this is a kangaroo court at this point.
Do you believe what they say, that the grand jury did this on their own?
That would be a shock to everybody in terms of whether a grand juror really instigated this on their own. It would be very, very rare. I've never seen that happen. Whether a grand juror said something, that may have happened. Maybe they had mentioned something in passing about a news story at the time. But we certainly know grand jurors are guided by the prosecution. So they're not going to be taken to this well to drink unless they're guided there by a prosecutor. So I don't believe that any grand juror went out of their way insisting on this particular investigation and insisted on an indictment either. I think that they were directed in that way, and I think we'll find out who exactly was in direct communication with the grand juror and what exactly was the motive there.
So you do believe that we'll get down to who actually kind of gave the idea for the grand juror?
I certainly hope so. I think there will be, all efforts will be made to do that. You know, we can't force anybody to say anything, but I think that there will be significant oversight into how this came about, because look, if I'm indicted by this grand jury on any other charge, I would have some questions, and if I was their lawyer, I would have some questions. What is going on in this, as we said, kangaroo court? How many other people have grand jurors spoken to outside of their group, their particular grand jury? Those are very legitimate questions that I would be asking if I had been indicted by this grand jury.
Could there be any penalties if someone's found?
Sure, it's against the law to violate the secrecy of a grand jury, and it's against the law for any public official to engage in that behavior as well. And I think that those are some of the things that have been very concerning to the Attorney General. Aside from the fact that this indictment really it's not supported by the law or the elements of this particular crime, I think even bigger than that, she will have a concern about what's actually happening here in their grand jury process, and she's required to do that. That's part of her role as well. So that's going to be a separate and aside, and that's alarming. That's going to be alarming. That should be alarming to everybody, whether it's a prosecutor in any other part of the state or whether it's a criminal defense attorney. Everybody should be very, very concerned about that.
How should taxpayers feel when the city's already facing a budget crisis when we have a special grand jury investigation?
Yeah, that's exactly. You know, look, we are at the point where our budget is so bad that is basically every headline we see. Businesses closing down, people leaving the city, all of those things really force us to ask very serious questions about what we're expending our resources on. When we see a special grand jury being formed, a special prosecutor being named, court resources being spent on something like this, then it should be very concerning to the public when we have very, very serious issues to be addressing in the city. I have to say, though, at the end of the day, I do think maybe this will bring to light some more serious things that probably needed to be addressed. And I think that's why we see the press being locked out of some of these events.
Do you believe this is related to former DA Leon Cannizzaro and his role that just ended in Attorney General Murrill's office?
I don't see any connection. I think that this is more linked to political, an attempt to make some political, sort of like a 5-minute fame on the Calvin Duncan issue with the clerk of court. I think that that's what we see here. Everybody's sort of, using Calvin Duncan for personal political interests, and unfortunately they've weaponized the criminal justice system, and unfortunately for them it could result in some serious allegations about how we see criminal justice in the city of New Orleans right now.
But didn't the governor and the attorney general start that with the action to, through the legislature to remove Mr. Duncan before he was able to take office, but after he was elected with 68% of the vote?
Correct. So the legislation was to consolidate the courts, to put Orleans in line with the rest of the state. That had long been legislation that had been discussed since, I believe it was the late 80s, about consolidating the courts. Orleans was the only parish that had a separate civil and criminal district court. Amidst the budget crisis, it was obviously it seemed like the time to consolidate those courts. That sparked the outrage of consolidating the courts because in the legislation it named Chelsea Napoleon, the clerk with the longer tenure, as the remaining clerk. And so I think that we saw after that, really some of our local politicians stepping up on that soapbox, using the Calvin Duncan story to elevate themselves a little bit and this narrative. And I really think that's what it is. It's a weaponization of the criminal justice system, but stemming from legislation that was really long overdue and smart fiscally.
Considering the fact that Judge Roche's position was allegedly saved in recent legislation, how do you take everything that happened today?
Well, I think Judge Roche is not exempt from when I say people are trying to utilize the system for personal politics. I think he's in for a difficult judicial race. He's going to be facing Judge Rhonda Good Douglas, and I think that potentially that this is something he would like to see benefit him by taking on the Attorney General. Unfortunately, I think he really didn't cross his T's and dot his I's in that process. We see some major mistakes here. He certainly has conflicts of interest for himself. I mean, we know that he was recently caught conducting fake trials. He has cases pending before him that are the Attorney General's cases to be prosecuted. And then he really fails to do his due diligence in determining that Lori White would not have been free of conflict in being appointed a special prosecutor here. So, very, very unfortunate missteps by Judge Roche here.
Could you repeat your name and title, please? I missed it at the beginning.
My name is Laura Cannizzaro Rodrigue, and I'm representing the Attorney General.
And Laura, you made some allegations both against the judge as well as Lori White. Is there any concern there that, you guys don't have the facts yet of what could have actually happened?
We're using the information that we have came directly from former Judge Lori White herself. She has reached out to the Attorney General's office, and so that information isn't speculative, it's coming straight from her. So I don't think there's any concern that those facts are wrong unless she's going to admit that she lied there. And the issues stated by the conflict are fact. They're documented facts. So I think there are more facts that haven't come out yet, and we look forward to seeing those. And I won't speculate as to what those are. I won't go on the record on those yet, but I think that we all know that there's more to come here, and it's really a sad day for criminal justice in the city of New Orleans.
Are you also angry, Laura?
I'm sorry, what?
Are you also angry?
Well, look, as a former prosecutor, I'm angry to see this happening. This is not how we use the criminal justice system. This is very, very sad. It could affect a lot of prosecutions here. We expect jurors to come into the city of New Orleans and think that the system is working fairly, and that the people representing the state of Louisiana are not doing anything wrong. And this will this will really go to the credibility of the system. That's very, very disappointing for all of us who work in this building or who have worked in this building. It's very disappointing, I'm sure, to some of the judges here who work very hard and really go out of their way to make sure that fairness and the press is allowed to see what's going on. So disappointing on a lot of fronts. I don't think that this particular judge, Judge Roche or Judge Lori White, necessarily represent everybody in this building, but it's certainly disappointing, and I hate to see what effect it will have on criminal justice in the city. Thank you all.
One more question. Do you think that there was a reason the media was left in the dark on this?
I think that they are. I think there are things that they have concerns about, and I think that that will come to light, and I hope the media does their job to that respect.
She says they're concerned about the safety of the grand jury is why they were doing this, even though the law is clear in Code 383.
You know, I think saying you have concerns about the safety of the grand jury is somewhat ironic given the fact that you're leaking direct conversations of the grand jury to the public. To me, that would raise much more safety concern about a grand juror. If I'm a grand juror and I'm being told that everything that I'm saying or deliberating about is secret, and I find out that people are running out and telling the public, that has serious repercussions. Imagine being on a grand jury sitting on a murder trial. How do you think that plays out when you go into the public and the public is made aware of maybe who was on the grand jury or what was being said before they indict a murderer? Those have serious consequences. So safety of a grand jury, to me, this is not the case, especially given the fact that they're leaking grand jury information. So I don't believe that. I also was told, and maybe you could verify, it's a $400,000 bond, is my understanding. Is that accurate?
I believe that's what she said.
So a $400,000 bond, remember, and you guys can do a little research out there, we're not seeing that on crimes of violence in the city of New Orleans, okay? So really think about that and apply that and ask yourselves, you know, what does that say about the city of New Orleans in terms of criminal justice? What message are we sending to the people, not only in New Orleans, but outside of New Orleans? As New Orleans goes and begs the state of Louisiana for money, hundreds of millions of dollars, they'll be back there in a couple of weeks. And this is sort of, as the governor said, the kangaroo court we expect here in the city. There are consequences for that. And so, you know, the bond, locking the press out, setting a $400,000 bond when we're not seeing that on armed robberies, you know, that certainly says what the motives are here, and I think the rest will speak for itself. Thank you all.